Essay 31 of Modern Essays, selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 31, The Fish Reporter, by Robert Cortez Holliday. This informal commentary on the picturesque humors of trade journalism is typical of Mr. Holliday's great skill in capturing the actual vibration of urban life. He has something of George Gissing's taste for the actuality of city scenes and characters, with rather more pungent idiosyncrasy in his manner of self-expression. Careful observers of the art of writing will see how much shrewd skill there is in the apparently unstudied manner. One of Mr. Holliday's favorite discussions on the art of writing is a phrase of Booth Tarkington's, "How to get the ink out of it." In other words, how to strip away mere literary and conscious adornment, and to get down to a translucent portraiture of life itself in its actual contour and profile. We are told that Mr. Holliday, in his native Indianapolis, where he was born in 1880, was a champion bicycle rider at the age of 16. That triumph, however, was not permanently satisfying, for he came to New York in 1899 to study art. Lived for a while, precariously, as an illustrator, worked for several years as a bookseller in Charles Scribner's retail store, and passed through all sorts of curious jobs on Grub Street, among others book reviewer on the Tribune and Times. He was editor of the Bookman after that magazine was taken over by the George H. Dorr & Company, and retired to the genteel dignity of contributing editor in 1920 to obtain leisure for more writing of his own. Mr. Holliday has the genuine gift of the personal essay, mellow, fluent, and pleasantly eccentric. His Walking Stick Papers, Broome Street Straws, Turns About Town, and Peeps at People have that charming, rambling humor that descends to him from his masters in this art, Hazlitt and Thackeray. When Mr. Holliday was racking his wits for a title for Men and Books and Cities, that odd Barrovian chronicle of his mind, body, and digestion on tour across the continent, I suggested The Odyssey of an Oddity. He deprecated this, but I still think it would have been a good title, because strictly true. Men of genius, blown by the winds of chance, have been, now and then, mariners, barkeeps, schoolmasters, soldiers, politicians, clergymen, and what not. And from these pursuits have they sucked the essence of yarns, and in the setting of these activities found a flavor to stir and to charm hearts untold. Now, it is a thousand pities that no man of genius has ever been a fish reporter. Thus has the world lost great literary treasure, as it is highly probable that there is not under the sun any prospect so filled with the scents and colors of story as that presented by the commerce in fish. Take whale oil. Take the funny old buildings on Front Street out of paintings, I declare, by Howard Pyle, where the large merchants in whale oil are. Take salt fish. Do you know the oldest salt fish house in America, down by Quinty's Slip? Ah, you should. The ghost of old Long John Silver, I suspect, smokes an occasional pipe in that old place. And many are the times I've seen the slim shade of young Jim Hawkins come running out. Take Labrador cod for export to the Mediterranean lands, or to Puerto Rico via New York. Take herrings brought to this port from Iceland, from Holland, and from Scotland; mackerel from Ireland, from the Magdalen Islands, and from Cape Breton; crab meat from Japan; fish balls from Scandinavia; sardines from Norway and from France; caviar from Russia; shrimp which comes from Florida, Mississippi, and Georgia; or salmon from Alaska and Puget Sound and the Columbia River. Take the obituaries of fishermen. In his prime, it is said, there was not a better skipper in the Gloucester fishing fleet. Take disasters to schooners, smacks, and trawlers. The crew were landed, but lost all their belongings. New vessels, sails, etc. The sealing schooner Tilly B., whose career in the South Seas is well known, is reported to have been sold to a moving picture firm. Sponges from the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. To most people, familiar only with the sponges of the shops, the animal as it comes from the sea would be rather unrecognizable." Why, take anything you please. It is such stuff as stories are. And as you eat your fish from the store, how little do you reck of the glamour of what you are doing. However, as it seems to me unlikely that a man of genius will be a fish reporter shortly, I will myself do the best I can to paint the tapestry of the scenes of his calling. The advertisement in the newspaper read, "Wanted, reporter for weekly trade paper." Many called, but I was chosen; though doubtless no man living knew less about fish than I. The newsstands are each like a fair, so laden are they with magazines in bright colors. It would seem almost as if there were a different magazine for every few 107th person, as the statistics put these matters, and yet it seems there is a very vast periodical literature of which we, that is, magazine readers in general, know nothing whatever. There is, for one, that fine old standard publication, Barrel and Box, devoted to the subjects and the interests of the coopering industry. There is, too, the Dried Fruit Packer and Western Canner, as alert a magazine as one could wish, in its kind. And from the home of classic American literature comes the New England Tradesman and Grocer. And so on. At the place alone where we went to press, 27 trade journals were printed every week, from one for butchers to one for bankers. The Fish Industries Gazette. Ah, yes. For some reason, not clear, though it is an engaging thing, I think, the word Gazette is the great word among the titles of trade journals. There is the Jeweller's Gazette, and the Woman's Wear Gazette, and the Poulterer's Gazette of London, and the Maritime Gazette of Halifax, and other gazettes quite without number. This word Gazette makes its appeal, too, curiously enough, to those who christen country papers, and trade journals have much of the intimate charm of country papers. The trade in each case is a kind of neighborly community, separated in its parts by space, but joined in unity of sympathy. Personals are a vital feature of trade papers. Walter Connor, who for some time has conducted a bakery and fish market at Hudson, New York, has removed to Fort Edward, leaving his brother Ed in charge of the Hudson place of business. The Fish Industries Gazette, as I say, was one of several in its field, in friendly rivalry with the Oyster Trade and Fishermen and the Pacific Fisheries. It comprised two departments, the Fresh Fish and Oyster Department, and myself. I was, as an editorial announcement said at the beginning of my tenure of office, a reorganization of our salt, smoked, and pickled fish department. The delectable, mellow spirit of the country paper, so removed from the crash and whir of metropolitan journalism, rested in this, too, that upon the Gazette I did practically everything on the paper except the linotyping. Reporter, editorial writer, exchange editor, make-up man, proofreader, correspondent, advertisement solicitor was I. As exchange editor did I read all the papers in the English language in eager search of fish news. And while you are about the matter, just find me a finer bit of literary style evoking the romance of the vast wastes of the moving sea in Stevenson, Defoe, anywhere you please, than such a news item as this. Captain Ezra Pound of the bark Elnora of Salem, Mass, spoke a lonely vessel in latitude this and longitude that, September 8. She proved to be the whaler Wanderer, and her captain said that she had been 9 months at sea, that all aboard were well, and that he had stocked so many barrels of whale oil. As exchange editor was it my business to peruse reports from Eastport, Maine, to the effect that one of the worst storms in recent years had destroyed large numbers of the sardine weirs there; to seek fish recipes of such savory sound as those for broiled red snapper, shrimps bordelaise, and baked fish croquettes; to follow fishing conditions in the North Sea occasioned by the Great War; to hunt down jokes of piscatory humor. "The man who drinks like a fish does not take kindly to water." exchange, to find other fillers in the consular reports and elsewhere. Fish culture in India, 1,800 miles in a dory, Chinese carp for the Philippines, Americans as fish eaters, and, to use a favorite term of trade papers, etc., etc. Then to paste up the winnowed fruits of this beguiling research. As editorial writer, to discuss the reports of the commission recently sent by Congress to the Pribilof Islands, Alaska, to report on the condition of our national herd of fur seals. To discuss the official interpretation here of the government ruling on what constitutes boneless codfish. To consider the campaign in Canada to promote there a more popular consumption of fish, and to brightly remark apropos of this that "a fish a day keeps the doctor away." To review the current issue of the Journal of the Fishery Society of Japan, containing leading articles on "Are Fishing Motorboats Able to Encourage in Our Country?" and "Fisherman, the late Mr. H. Yamaguchi well known." To combat the prejudice against dogfish as food, a prejudice like that against eels, in some quarters eyed askance as calling cousins with the great sea serpent, as Juvenal says. To call attention to the doom of one of the most picturesque monuments in the story of fish, the passing of the pleasant and celebrated old Trafalgar Hotel at Greenwich, near London, scene of the famous ministerial whitebait dinners of the days of Pitt. To make a jest on an exciting idea suggested by some medical man that some of the features of a Ritz-Carlton hotel, that is, baths, be introduced in the forecastles of Grand Bank's fishing vessels. To keep an eye on the activities of our Bureau of Fisheries. To hymn a praise to the monumental new fish pier at Boston. To glance at conditions at the premier fish market of the world, Billingsgate. To herald the fish display at the Canadian National Exhibition at Toronto, and indeed, etc., and again, etc. As general editorial roustabout, to find each week a leader, a translation, say, from In Allgemeine Fischereiszeitung, or Economic Circular No. 10, "Mussels in the Tributaries of the Missouri," or the last biennial report of the Superintendent of Fisheries of Wisconsin, or a scientific paper on "The Porpoise in Captivity," reprinted by permission of Zoologica of the New York Zoological Society. To find each week for reprint a poem appropriate in sentiment to the feeling of the paper. One of the Saltwater Ballads would do, or John Masefield singing of "The Whale's Way," or "Down to the White Dipping Sails," or Rupert Brooke, "And in that heaven of all their wish there shall be no more land, say fish," or a weather rhyme about mackerel skies, when you're sure to get a fishing day, or something from the New York Sun about the lobster pots of Maine, or Oliver Herford in the Century, "To a Goldfish," or, best of all, an old song of fishing ways of other days. And to compile from the New York Journal of Commerce better poetry than any of this, tables, beautiful tables of imports into New York. October 15. From Bordeaux, 225 cases cuttlefish bone. Copenhagen, 173 packages fish. Liverpool, 969 barrels herring, 10 walrus hides, 2,000 bags salt. La Guayra, 6 cases fish sounds. Belize, 9 barrels sponges. Rotterdam, 7 packages seaweed, 9,000 kegs herring. Barcelona, 235 cases sardines. Bocas del Toro, 5 cases turtle shells. Genoa, 3 boxes corals. Tampico, 2 packages sponges. Halifax, 1 case seal skins. 35 barrels cod liver oil. 215 cases lobsters. 490 barrels codfish. Akureyri, 4,150 barrels salted herrings, and much more, beautiful tables of exports from New York to Australia (cleared September 1st), to Argentina, Haiti, Jamaica, Guatemala, Scotland, Salvador, Santo Domingo, England, and to places many more. And many other gorgeous tables, too, fishing vessels at New York, For one, listing the trips brought into this port by the Stranger, the Sarah O'Neill, the Normal, a farrago of charming sounds, and a valuable tale of facts. As make-up man, of course, so to dress the paper that the markets, Oporto, Trinidad, Puerto Rico, Demerara, Havana, would be together. That Nova Scotia notes, "Weather conditions for curing have been more favorable since October set in," would follow Halifax Fish Market. Last week's arrivals were October 13, schooner Hattie Loring, 960 quintals, etc. That Pacific Coast notes, "The tug Tatoosh will perform the service for the Seattle salmon packers of towing a vessel from Seattle to this port via the Panama Canal," would follow canned salmon. That shellfish matter would be in one place, reports of salt fish where such should be. That the weekly tale of the canned fish trade politically embraced the canned fish advertising, and so on and so on. Finest of all, as reporter, to go where the fish reporter goes. There the sight-seeing cars never find their way, the hurried commuter has not his path, nor knows of these things at all. And there that racy character who, voicing a multitude, declares that he would rather be a lamp-post on Broadway than mayor of St. Louis, goes not for to see. Up Lower Greenwich Street the fish reporter goes, along an eerie, dark, and narrow way, beneath a strange thundering roof, the L overhead. He threads his way amid seemingly chaotic architectural piles of boxes, of barrels, crates, casks, kegs, and bulging bags. Roundabout many great fetlocked draught horses, frequently standing or plunging upon the sidewalk, and attached to many huge trucks and wagons; and much of the time in the street he is compelled to go, finding the sidewalks too congested with the traffic of commerce to admit of his passing there. You probably eat butter and eggs and cheese. Then you would delight in Greenwich Street. You would feast your highly creditable appetite for these excellent things for very nearly a solid mile upon the signs of wholesale dealers and commission merchants in them. The letterpress, as you might say, of the fish reporter's walk is a noble paean to the earth's glorious yield for the joyous sustenance of man. For these princely merchants' signs sing of opulent stores of olive oil, of sausages, beans, soups, extracts, and spices, sugar, Spanish, Bermuda, and Havana onions, fine apples, teas, coffee, rice, chocolates, dried fruits and raisins, and of loaves and of fishes and of fish products. Low, dark and dirty and thundering Greenwich Street is today's translation of the Garden of Eden. Here is a great house whose sole vocation is the importation of caviar for barter here. Caviar from overseas now comes, when it comes at all, mainly by the way of Archangel, recently put on the map, for most of us, by the war. The fish reporter is told, however, if it be summer, that there cannot be much doing in the way of caviar until fall, when the spoonbill start coming in. And on he goes to a great salt fish house, where many men in salt-stained garments are running about, their arms laden with large flat objects of sharp and jagged edge, which resemble dried and crackling hides of some animal curiously like a huge fish; and numerous others of the same are trundling round wheelbarrow-like trucks likewise so laden; where stacks of these hides stand on their tails against the walls, and goodness knows how many big boxes are containing, as those open show, beautifully soft, thick, cream-colored slabs, which is fish; and where still other men, in overalls stained like a painter's palette, are knocking off the heads of casks, and dipping out of brine still other kinds of fish for inspection. Here it is said by the head of the house, by the stove (it is chill weather), in his office like a shipmaster's cabin, "Strong market on foreign mackerel. Mines hinder Norway catch. Advices from abroad report that German resources continue to purchase all available supplies from the Norwegian fishermen. No Irish of any account. Recent shipment sold on the deck at high prices. Fair demand from the Middle West." So by stages on up to turn into North Moore Street, looking down a narrow lane between two long, bristling rows of wagons pointed out from the curbs, to the façades of the North River docks at the bottom, with the tops of the buff funnels of ocean liners and Whistlerian silhouettes of derricks rising beyond. Hereabouts are more importers, exporters, and producers of fish, famous in their calling beyond the celebrities of popular publicity; and he that has official entrée may learn, by mounting dusky stairs, half ladder and half stair, and by passing through low-ceilinged chambers, freighted with many barrels, to the sanctums of the fish lords, what's doing in the foreign herring way, and get the current market quotations, at present sky high, and hear that the American shore mackerel catch is very fine stock. Then round about, with a step into the broad vista of homely Washington Street, and a turn through Franklin Street, where is the man decorated by the Imperial Japanese Government with a gold medal, if he should care to wear it, for having distinguished himself in the development of commerce in the marine products of Japan, back to Hudson Street. An authentic railroad is one of the spectacular features of Hudson Street. Here down the middle of the way are endless trains, stopping, starting, crashing, laden to their ears with freight, doubtless all to eat. Tourists should come from very far to view Hudson Street. Here is a spectacle as fascinating, as awe-inspiring, as extraordinary as any in the world. From dawn until darkness falls, hour after hour, along Hudson Street slowly, steadily moves a mighty procession of great trucks. One would not suppose there were so many trucks on the face of the earth. It is a glorious sight, and many men whose soul is not dead would jump with joy to see it. And the thunder of them all together as they bang over the stones is like the music of the spheres. There is on Hudson Street a tall, handsome building where the fish reporter goes, which should be enjoyed in this way. Up in the lift you go to the top, then you walk down, smacking your lips, for all the doors in that building are brimming with poetry, and the tune of it goes like this: Toasted Cornflake Company, Seaboard Rice, Chili Products, Red Bloom Grape Juice Sales Office, Puerto Rico and Singapore Pineapple Company, Sunnyland Foodstuffs, Importers of Fruit Pulps, Pimentos, Sole Agents, U.S.A. Italian Salad Oil, Raisin Growers, Log Cabin Syrups, Jobbers in Beans, Peas, Chocolate and Cocoa Preparations, Ohio Evaporated Milk Company, Bernese Alps and Holland Condensed Milk Company, Brazilian Nuts Company, Brokers Pacific Coast Salmon, California Tuna Company, and thus on and on. The fish reporter crosses the street to see the head of the Sardine Trust, who has just thrown the market into excitement by a heavy cut in prices of last year's pack. Thence, pausing to refresh himself by the way at a sign Agency for Reims Champagne and Moselle Wines, Bordeaux Clarets and Sauternes, over to Broadway to interview the most august person of all, dealers in fertilizer, fish scrap. These mighty gentlemen live, when at business, in palatial suites of offices, constructed of marble and fine woods and laid with rich rugs. The reporter is relayed into the innermost sanctum by a succession of richly clothed attendants; and he learns, it may be, that fishing in Chesapeake Bay is so poor that some of the fish factories may decide to shut down. Acid phosphate, it is said, is ruling at $13 F.O.B. Baltimore. And so the fish reporter enters upon the last lap of his rounds. Through perhaps the narrow crooked lane of Pine Street he passes, to come out at length upon a scene set for a sea tale. Here would a lad, heir to vast estates in Virginia, be kidnapped and smuggled aboard to be sold a slave in Africa. This is Front Street. A white ship lies at the foot of it. Cranes rise at her side. Tugs, belching smoke, bob beyond. All about are ancient warehouses, redolent of the Thames, with steep roofs and sometimes stairs outside, and with tall shutters, a crescent-shaped hole in each. There is a dealer in weather vanes. Other things dealt in hereabouts are these: chronometers, nautical instruments, wax gums, cordage and twine, marine paints, cotton wool and waste, turpentine, oils, greases and rosin. Queer old taverns, public houses are here too. Why do not their windows rattle with a yo-ho-ho? There is an old, old house whose business has been fish oil within the memory of men. And here is another. Next, through Water Street, one comes in search of the last word on salt fish. Now the air is filled with gorgeous smell of roasting coffee. Tea, coffee, sugar, rice, spices, bags and bagging here have their home. And there are haughty bonded warehouses filled with fine liquors. From his white cabin at the top of a venerable structure comes the dean of the salt fish business. "Export trade fair," he says. "Good demand from South America." End of Essay 31. Essay 32 of Modern Essays, selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 32, Some Nonsense About a Dog, by Harry S.T. Downes. Harry S.T. Downes was born in Syracuse in 1889 and graduated from Hamilton College in 1910. His first job was a cub reporter on the journal that newspapermen affectionately call the Old Sun. The adjective is pronounced as though it were in italics. He was on the staff of the Syracuse Herald, 1912 14, spent a year in New Orleans writing short stories, and returned in 1916 to the magazine staff of the Sun. He was editor of the Sun's book review section, 1919 20. In 1920 he joined the staff of the New York Evening Post. My hand will miss the insinuated nose. Sir William Watson. But the dog that was written of must have been a big dog. Nibby was just a comfortable lapful, once he had duly turned round and curled up with his nose in his tail. This is for people who know about dogs, in particular little mongrels without pedigree or market value. Other people, no doubt, will find it disgustingly maudlin. I would have found it so before Nibby came. The day he came was a beautiful, bright, cool one in an August. A touring car brought him. They put him down on our corner, meaning to lose him, but he crawled under the car, and they had to prod him out and throw stones before they could drive on. So that when I came home I found with his mistress-elect a sort of pot-bellied bundle of tarry oakum, caked with mud, panting convulsively still from fright, and showing the whites of uncommonly liquid brown eyes and a pink tongue. There was tennis that evening, and he went along. I carried him over the railroad tracks. He gave us no trouble about the balls, but lay huddled under the bench where she sat, and shivered if a man came near him. That night he got chop bones, and she got a sensible homily on the unwisdom of feeding strays, and he was left outdoors. He slept on the mat. The second morning we thought he had gone. The third he was back, wagging approval of us, and intent to stay, which seemed to leave no choice but to take him in. We had fun over names. Jellywaggles, suggested from next door, was undeniably descriptive. Rags fitted, or Toby, or Nig, but they had a colored maid next door. Finally we called him Nibs, and soon his tail would answer to it. Cleaned up, scrubbed, the insoluble matted locks clipped from his coat, his trampish collar replaced with a new one bearing a license tag, he was far from being unpresentable. A vet once opined that for a mongrel he was a good dog, that a black cocker mother had thrown her cap over Scottish mills, so to speak. This analysis accounted for him perfectly. Always, depending on the moment's mood, he was either terrier or spaniel, the snap and scrap and perk of the one alternating with the gentle, snuggling indolence of the other. As terrier he would dig furiously by the hour after a field mouse. As spaniel he would "read the breeze" with the best nose among the dog folk of our neighborhood, or follow a trail quite well. I know there was retrieving blood. A year ago May he caught and brought me, not doing the least injury, an oriole that probably had flown against a wire and was struggling disabled in the grass. Nibby was shaggy, genteel black, burnt as to the mustache, grizzled as to the raggy fringe on his haunches. He had a white stock and shirt frill and a white forepaw. The brown eyes, full of heart, were the best part. His body coat was rough Scottish worsted, the little black pate was cotton soft like shoddy, and the big black ears were genuine spaniel silk. As a terrier he held them up smartly, and carried a plumy fish hook of a tail. As a spaniel the ears drooped and the tail swung meekly as if in apology for never having been clipped. The other day, when we had to say goodbye to him, each of us cut one silky tuft from an ear, very much as we had so often when he'd been among the burdocks in the field where the garden is. Burrs were by no means Nibby's only failing. In flea time it seems hardly possible that a dog of his size could sustain his population. We finally found a true flea bane, but deserted one day, he was populous again the next. They don't relish every human. Me they did. I used to storm at him for it, and he used, between spasms of scratching, to listen admiringly and wag. We think he supposed his tormentors were winged insects, for he sought refuge in dark clothes closets where a flying imp wouldn't logically come. He was willful, insisted on landing in laps when their makers wanted to read. He would make advances to visitors who were polite about him. He would get up on the living-room table, why and how, heaven knows, finding his opportunity when we were out of the house, and taking care to be upstairs on a bed, white, grimeable coverlets preferred, by the time we had the front door open. I used to slip up to the porch and catch through a window the diving flourish of his sinful tail. One of his faults must have been a neurosis, really. He had a hard life before we took him in, as witness the game hind leg that made him sit up side-saddle fashion, and 2 such scars on his back as boiling hot grease might have made. And something especially cruel had been done to him when asleep, for if you bent over him napping or in his bed, he would half rouse and growl, and sometimes snap blindly. We dreaded exuberant visiting children. 2 or 3 experiments I hate to remember now convinced me that it couldn't be whipped out of him, and once wide awake he was sure to be perplexedly apologetic. He was spoiled. That was our doing. We babied him abominably. He was for 2 years the only subject we had for such malpractice. He had more foolish names than Wog, that dog of Mrs. Stevenson's, and heard more little language than Stella ever did, reciprocating by kissing proffered ears in his doggy way. Once he had brightened up after his arrival, he showed himself ready to take an ell whenever we gave an inch, and he was always taking them and never paying penalties. He had conscience enough to be sly. I remember the summer evening we stepped outside for just an instant, and came back to find a curious groove across the butter, on the dining-room table, and an ever so innocent Nibby in a chair in the next room. While we were at the table he was generally around it, bulldozing for tidbits. I fear he had reason to know that this would work. One fortnight, when his Missy was away, he slept on his old man's bed (we had dropped titles of dignity with him by then), and he rang the welkin hourly, answering far-away dog friends, and occasionally came north to lollop my face with tender solicitude, just like the fool nurse in the story, waking the patient up to ask if he was sleeping well. More recently, when a beruffled basket was waiting, he developed an alarming trick of stealing in there to try it, so I fitted that door with a hook, ensuring a crack impervious to dogs. And the other night I had to take the hook, now useless, off. We couldn't stand hearing it jingle. He adopted the junior member on first sight and sniff of him, by the way, would look on beaming as proudly as if he'd hatched him. The last of his iniquities arose from a valor that lacked its better part, an absurd mixture of Falstaff and bantam rooster. At the critical point he'd back out of a fuss with a dog of his own size. But let a police dog, an Airedale, a St. Bernard, or a big ugly cur appear, and Nibby was all around him, blackguarding him unendurably. It was lucky that the big dogs in our neighborhood were patient, and he never would learn about automobiles. Usually tried to tackle them head on, often stopped cars with merciful drivers. When the car wouldn't stop, luck would save him by a fraction of an inch. I couldn't spank that out of him, either. We had really been expecting what finally happened for 2 years. That's about all. Too much, I am afraid. A decent fate made it quick the other night, and clean and close at hand, in fact, on the same street corner where once a car had left the small scapegrace for us. We tell ourselves how glad we are it happened as it did, instead of an agonal ending such as many of his people come to. We tell ourselves we couldn't have had him forever in any event, that some day, for the junior member's sake, we shall get another dog. We keep telling ourselves these things, and talking with animation on other topics. The muzzle, the leash, the drinking dish are hidden, the last muddy paw track swept up, the nose smudges washed off the favorite front window pane. But the house is full of a little snoofing, wagging, loving ghost. I know how the boy Thoreau felt about a hereafter with dogs barred. I want to think that somewhere, sometime, I will be coming home again, and that when the door opens, Nibby will be on hand to caper welcome. End of Essay 32. Essay 33 of Modern Essays selected by Christopher Morley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay 33, The 51st Dragon, by Heywood Broome. Heywood Broome, who has risen rapidly through the ranks of newspaper honor from sporting reporter and war correspondent to one of the most highly regarded dramatic and literary critics in the country, is another of these Harvard men, but as far as this book is concerned, the last of them. Broome graduated from Harvard in 1910, was several years on the New York Tribune, and is now on the World. There is no more substantially gifted newspaper man in his field. His beautifully spontaneous humor and drollery are counterbalanced by a fine imaginative sensitiveness and a remarkable power in the fable or allegorical essay, such as the one here reprinted. His book, Seeing Things at Night, is only the first fruit of truly splendid possibilities. If I may be allowed to prophesy, thus hazarding all, I will say that Heywood Broome is likely in the next 10 or 15 years to do as fine work, both imaginative and critical, as any living American of his era. Of all the pupils at the night school, Gawain le Cœur Hardy was among the least promising. He was tall and sturdy, but his instructors soon discovered that he lacked spirit. He would hide in the woods when the jousting class was called, although his companions and members of the faculty sought to appeal to his better nature by shouting to him to come out and break his neck like a man. Even when they told him that the lances were padded, the horses no more than ponies, and the field unusually soft for late autumn, Gawain refused to grow enthusiastic. The headmaster and the assistant professor of Plaisance were discussing the case one spring afternoon, and the assistant professor could see no remedy but expulsion. "No," said the headmaster, as he looked out at the purple hills which ringed the school, "I think I'll train him to slay dragons." "He might be killed," objected the assistant professor. "So he might," replied the headmaster brightly, but he added more soberly, "We must consider the greater good. We are responsible for the formation of this lad's character." "Are the dragons particularly bad this year?" interrupted the assistant professor. This was characteristic. He always seemed restive when the head of the school began to talk ethics and the ideals of the institution. "I've never known them worse," replied the headmaster. "Up in the hills to the south last week they killed a number of peasants, 2 cows and a prize pig. And if this dry spell holds, there's no telling when they might start a forest fire simply by breathing around indiscriminately." "Would any refund on the tuition fee be necessary in case of an accident to young Cœur Hardy?" "No," the principal answered judicially. "That's all covered in the contract. But as a matter of fact, he won't be killed. Before I send him up in the hills, I'm going to give him a magic word." "That's a good idea," said the professor. "Sometimes they work wonders." From that day on, Gawaine specialized in dragons. His course included both theory and practice. In the morning there were long lectures on the history, anatomy, manners, and customs of dragons. Gawaine did not distinguish himself in these studies. He had a marvelous versatile gift for forgetting things. In the afternoon he showed to better advantage, for then he would go down to the south meadow and practice with a battle axe. In this exercise he was truly impressive, for he had enormous strength as well as speed and grace. He even developed a deceptive display of ferocity. Old alumni say that it was a thrilling sight to see Gawaine charging across the field toward the dummy paper dragon which had been set up for his practice. As he ran he would brandish his axe and shout, "A murrain on thee!" or some other vivid bit of campus slang. It never took him more than 1 stroke to behead the dummy dragon. Gradually his task was made more difficult. Paper gave way to papier mâché and finally to wood, but even the toughest of these dummy dragons had no terrors for Gawaine. 1 sweep of the axe always did the business. There were those who said that when the practice was protracted until dusk and the dragons threw long fantastic shadows across the meadow, Gawaine did not charge so impetuously nor shout so loudly. It is possible there was malice in this charge. At any rate, the headmaster decided by the end of June that it was time for the test. Only the night before a dragon had come close to the school grounds and had eaten some of the lettuce from the garden. The faculty decided that Gawaine was ready. They gave him a diploma and a new battle axe, and the headmaster summoned him to a private conference. "Sit down," said the headmaster. "Have a cigarette." Gawaine hesitated. "Oh, I know it's against the rules," said the headmaster, "but after all, you have received your preliminary degree. You are no longer a boy. You are a man. Tomorrow you will go out into the world, the great world of achievement." Gawaine took a cigarette. The headmaster offered him a match, but he produced one of his own and began to puff away with a dexterity which quite amazed the principal. "Here you have learned the theories of life," continued the headmaster, resuming the thread of his discourse. "But after all, life is not a matter of theories. Life is a matter of facts. It calls on the young and the old alike to face these facts, even though they are hard and sometimes unpleasant. Your problem, for example, is to slay dragons." "They say that those dragons down in the South Wood are 500 feet long," ventured Gawaine timorously. "Stuff and nonsense!" said the headmaster. "The curate saw one last week from the top of Arthur's Hill. The dragon was sunning himself down in the valley. The curate didn't have an opportunity to look at him very long because he felt it was his duty to hurry back to make a report to me. He said the monster, or shall I say the big lizard, wasn't an inch over 200 feet. But the size has nothing at all to do with it. You'll find the big ones even easier than the little ones. They're far slower on their feet and less aggressive, I'm told. Besides, before you go, I'm going to equip you in such fashion that you need have no fear of all the dragons in the world." "I'd like an enchanted cap," said Gawaine. "What's that?" answered the headmaster testily. "A cap to make me disappear," explained Gawaine. The headmaster laughed indulgently. "You mustn't believe all those old wives' stories," he said. "There isn't any such thing. "A cap to make you disappear, indeed! What would you do with it? You haven't even appeared yet. Why, my boy, you could walk from here to London and nobody would so much as look at you. You're nobody. You couldn't be more invisible than that." Gawaine seemed dangerously close to a relapse into his old habit of whimpering. The headmaster reassured him. "Don't worry, I'll give you something much better than an enchanted cap. I'm going to give you a magic word. All you have to do is to repeat this magic charm once, and no dragon can possibly harm a hair of your head. You can cut off his head at your leisure." He took a heavy book from the shelf behind his desk and began to run through it. "Sometimes," he said, "the charm is a whole phrase or even a sentence. I might, for instance, give you to make the No, that might not do. I think a single word would be best for dragons." "A short word," suggested Gawaine. "It can't be too short or it wouldn't be potent. There isn't so much hurry as all that. Here's a splendid magic word. Rumplesnitz. Do you think you can learn that?" Gawaine tried, and in an hour or so he seemed to have the word well in hand. Again and again he interrupted the lesson to inquire, "And if I say Rumplesnitz, the dragon can't possibly hurt me?" And always the headmaster replied, "If you only say Rumplesnitz, you are perfectly safe." Toward morning Gawaine seemed resigned to his career. At daybreak the headmaster saw him to the edge of the forest and pointed him to the direction in which he should proceed. About a mile away to the southwest a cloud of steam hovered over an open meadow in the woods, and the headmaster assured Gawaine that under the steam he would find a dragon. Gawaine went forward slowly. He wondered whether it would be best to approach the dragon on the run, as he did in his practice in the south meadow, or to walk slowly toward him shouting "Rumplesnitz" all the way. The problem was decided for him. No sooner had he come to the fringe of the meadow than the dragon spied him and began to charge. It was a large dragon, and yet it seemed decidedly aggressive in spite of the headmaster's statement to the contrary. As the dragon charged, it released huge clouds of hissing steam through its nostrils. It was almost as if a gigantic teapot had gone mad. The dragon came forward so fast, and Gawaine was so frightened, that he had time to say "Rumplesnitz" only once. As he said it, he swung his battle axe, and off popped the head of the dragon. Gawaine had to admit that it was even easier to kill a real dragon than a wooden one, if only you said "Rumplesnitz." Gawaine brought the ears home and a small section of the tail. His schoolmates and the faculty made much of him, but the headmaster wisely kept him from being spoiled by insisting that he go on with his work. Every clear day Gawaine rose at dawn and went out to kill dragons. The headmaster kept him at home when it rained, because he said the woods were damp and unhealthy at such times, and that he didn't want the boy to run needless risks. Few good days passed in which Gawaine failed to get a dragon. On one particularly fortunate day he killed 3, a husband and wife and a visiting relative. Gradually he developed a technique. Pupils who sometimes watched him from the hilltops a long way off said that he often allowed the dragon to come within a few feet before he said "Rumplesnitz." He came to say it with a mocking sneer. Occasionally he did stunts. Once, when an excursion party from London was watching him, he went into action with his right hand tied behind his back. The dragon's head came off just as easily. As Gawaine's record of killings mounted higher, the headmaster found it impossible to keep him completely in hand. He fell into the habit of stealing out at night and engaging in long drinking bouts at the village tavern. It was after such a debauch that he rose a little before dawn one fine August morning and started out after his 50th dragon. His head was heavy and his mind sluggish. He was heavy in other respects as well, for he had adopted the somewhat vulgar practice of wearing his medals, ribbons and all, when he went out dragon hunting. The decorations began on his chest and ran all the way down to his abdomen. They must have weighed at least 8 pounds. Gawain found a dragon in the same meadow where he had killed the first one. It was a fair-sized dragon, but evidently an old one. Its face was wrinkled, and Gawain thought he had never seen so hideous a countenance. Much to the lad's disgust, the monster refused to charge, and Gawain was obliged to walk toward him. He whistled as he went. The dragon regarded him hopelessly but craftily. Of course it had heard of Gawain. Even when the lad raised his battle-axe, the dragon made no move. It knew that there was no salvation in the quickest thrust of the head, for it had been informed that this hunter was protected by an enchantment. It merely waited, hoping something would turn up. Gawain raised the battle-axe and suddenly lowered it again. He had grown very pale, and he trembled violently. The dragon suspected a trick. "What's the matter?" it asked with false solicitude. "I've forgotten the magic word," stammered Gawain. "What a pity!" said the dragon. "So that was the secret. It doesn't seem quite sporting to me, all this magic stuff, you know. Not cricket, as we used to say when I was a little dragon. But after all, that's a matter of opinion." Gawain was so helpless with terror that the dragon's confidence rose immeasurably, and it could not resist the temptation to show off a bit. "Could I possibly be of any assistance?" it asked. "What's the first letter of the magic word?" "It begins with an R," said Gawain weakly. "Let's see," mused the dragon. "That doesn't tell us much, does it? What sort of a word is this? Is it an epithet, do you think?" Gawain could do no more than nod. "Why, of course," exclaimed the dragon. "Reactionary Republican." Gawain shook his head. "Well, then," said the dragon, "we'd better get down to business. Will you surrender?" With the suggestion of a compromise, Gawain mustered up enough courage to speak. "What will you do if I surrender?" he asked. "Why, I'll eat you," said the dragon. "And if I don't surrender?" "I'll eat you just the same." "Then it doesn't mean any difference, does it?" moaned Gawain. "It does to me," said the dragon with a smile. "I'd rather you didn't surrender. You'd taste much better if you don't." The dragon waited for a long time for Gawain to ask why, but the boy was too frightened to speak. At last the dragon had to give the explanation without his cue line. "You see," he said, "if you don't surrender, you'll taste much better because you'll die game." This was an old and ancient trick of the dragon's. By means of some such quip he was accustomed to paralyze his victims with laughter, and then to destroy them. Gawain was sufficiently paralyzed as it was, but laughter had no part in his helplessness. With the last word of the joke the dragon drew back his head and struck. In that second there flashed into the mind of Gawain the magic word "Rumplesnitz," but there was no time to say it. There was time only to strike, and without a word Gawain met the onrush of the dragon with a full swing. He put all his back and shoulders into it. The impact was terrific, and the head of the dragon flew away almost 100 yards and landed in a thicket. Gawain did not remain frightened very long after the death of the dragon. His mood was one of wonder. He was enormously puzzled. He cut off the ears of the monster almost in a trance. Again and again he thought to himself, "I didn't say Rumplesnitz." He was sure of that, and yet there was no question that he had killed the dragon. In fact, he had never killed one so utterly. Never before had he driven ahead for anything like the same distance. 25 yards was perhaps his best previous record. All the way back to the night school he kept rumbling about it in his mind, seeking an explanation for what had occurred. He went to the headmaster immediately, and after closing the door told him what had happened. "I didn't say Rumplesnitz," he explained with great earnestness. The headmaster laughed. "I'm glad you found out," he said. "It makes you ever so much more of a hero. Don't you see that? Now you know that it was you who killed all these dragons, and not that foolish little word, Rumplesnitz." Gawain frowned. "Then it wasn't a magic word, after all?" he asked. "Of course not," said the headmaster. "You ought to be too old for such foolishness. There isn't any such thing as a magic word." "But you told me it was magic," protested Gawaine. "You said it was magic, and now you say it isn't." "It wasn't magic in a literal sense," answered the headmaster, "but it was much more wonderful than that. The word gave you confidence. It took away your fears. If I hadn't told you that, you might have been killed the very first time. It was your battle axe did the trick." Gawaine surprised the headmaster by his attitude. He was obviously distressed by the explanation. He interrupted a long philosophic and ethical discourse by the headmaster with, "If I hadn't a hit 'em all mighty hard and fast, any one of 'em might have crushed me like a—" He fumbled for a word. "Eggshell?" suggested the headmaster. "Like a eggshell," assented Gawaine, and he said it many times. All through the evening meal people who sat near him heard him muttering, "Like a eggshell, like a eggshell." The next day was clear, but Gawaine did not get up at dawn. Instead, it was almost noon when the headmaster found him cowering in bed with the clothes pulled up over his head. The principal called the assistant professor of Pleasaunce, and together they dragged the boy toward the forest. "He'll be all right as soon as he gets a couple more dragons under his belt," explained the headmaster. The assistant professor of Pleasaunce agreed. "It would be a shame to stop such a fine run," he said. "Why, counting that one yesterday, he's killed 50 dragons." They pushed the boy into a thicket above which hung a meager cloud of steam. It was obviously quite a small dragon. But Gawaine did not come back that night, or the next. In fact, he never came back. Some weeks afterward, brave spirits from the school explored the thicket, but they could find nothing to remind them of Gawaine except the metal parts of his medals. Even the ribbons had been devoured. The headmaster and the assistant professor of Pleasaunce agreed that it would be just as well not to tell the school how Gawaine had achieved his record, and still less how he came to die. They held that it might have a bad effect on school spirit. Accordingly, Gawaine has lived in the memory of the school as its greatest hero. No visitor succeeds in leaving the building today without seeing a great shield which hangs on the wall of the dining hall. 50 pairs of dragon's ears are mounted upon the shield, and underneath in gilt letters is "Gawaine le Cœur Hardy," followed by the simple inscription, "He killed 50 dragons." The record has never been equaled. End of Essay 33. End of Modern Essays selected by Christopher Morley.